Starkville, Mississippi, in the 90s was a town with a population of less than 20,000, the home of Mississippi State University, a town with much community spirit and loving neighbors, a town where you could feel safe and leave your homes and cars unlocked. You could walk at night alone. That was until one fateful night on September 3rd, 1993, when two elderly women were attacked, leaving one dead and one to die. Is the perpetrator local? Is there a connection to other crimes in the areas? Is he a transient that is long gone? I am the loud little ducky, and this is Migrating True Crime in the U.S. Join me as we make our first stop in Mississippi and learn of the Labor Day murders of the deaths of Betty Jones and Kathryn Crigler. So the first thing I want to do is to introduce to you two amazing women that this case is about, because that is what should be highlighted in these stories we tell, the victims. They are who matters. They are what is important when we tell these stories. Betty Jones was born Sarah Elizabeth Johnson on October 8, 1924, to the parents of Harper and Sarah. Betty, as people called her, graduated Starkville High School, then attended Mississippi State. Shortly after graduating, she met her first husband, Tinsley Thrower, and married in 1952. Betty and Tinsley then went on to have a daughter named Patricia. On November 12, 1953, Betty experienced a horrible and unthinkable loss that no one could fathom. Patricia passed away at 21 months old. Betty and her daughter were going to run errands, and somehow her daughter, Patricia, had fallen out, and Betty hit her not knowing she had. Now, this was a time before seatbelts in cars was even a thing. Later, Betty and her husband would go on to adopt two children, a son and a daughter. In October of 1975, Betty's husband died of heart complications in surgery. Shortly after her husband's death, Betty moved back to Starkville. I don't know when she moved away, but eventually she did come back to Starkville, which was basically home for her. And that was to be surrounded by family and her children who were already there attending her alma mater, MS, or Mississippi State. Later, she met a man named Ernest Jones, who was a widow as well. Now, while this marriage was only 3.5 years, this connection would still be important 25 years after Betty's murder. You see, when Betty married Ernest, she ended up with his family, and Betty's now step-grandson at this point, who played a major role in getting this case into the spotlight and the story told, as they became closer and closer to solving it. The step-grandson's name is Jason, and he has a podcast called Knock Knock, which I will have linked below if you want more details about this case. It is one of the sources for bringing this case to y'all. But Betty loved Ernest's family as her own. She even stayed in touch with them after Ernest had passed away in late 1981. Betty was a homemaker who loved to cook, and she had also been a secretary of a local hospital's auxiliary. She was an avid Mississippi State baseball fan and served as the Mississippi State baseball mom, even during the time that MLB stars like Will Clark and Rafael Palmeiro attended Mississippi State. And to me, that is a really cool job. If I retired and I could be a baseball mom, that would be like a dream. That you get to travel and watch the games, and that just sounds like a joy to me. But along with those things, she was a member of the Junior Auxiliary and an honorary life member in the Presbyterian Women's at the church. She served as a deacon and an elder at her church and served on other committees in the churches through her life. When she was the Mississippi State baseball mom, Betty would bring chewing gum so that the players and the students wouldn't take on other things, such as chewing tobacco. She was there to lift the spirits of the kids who maybe were homesick and just wanted to go home. It's their first time away from their parents and they're away at college. But she was there to be a comfort to them. So as you can see, this woman, Betty Jones, was remarkable. She was caring. She just loved others. And that is something amazing. So moving on to another important and crucial person in this case, and Betty's dear friend, Kathryn Crigler. Kathryn was born January 7th, 1909 to the parents of Joseph and Elizabeth. Kathryn, just like Betty, graduated from Starkville High School. When Kathryn graduated, she went to study at MSW, Mississippi State's for Women. After that, she married Albert Crigler, and they had 2 children, a daughter and a son, that she raised in the house that was now just a horrible memory. She did eventually have 4 grandchildren as well. At one point, Kathryn ended up going to New York to be trained in music, which she loved. Kathryn was a school teacher for most of her career life, but she did later work at MSU professionally as an accompanied pianist and vocalist. She would even be a wedding soloist within her church. Kathryn became a widow in 1981. Kathryn had her own difficulties in life, being that she was a breast cancer survivor in early adulthood. Sadly, in 1989, she became ill again, unfortunately getting to a point where her left leg had to be amputated and confining her to a wheelchair. Kathryn was also a big sports fan like her friend Betty. Kathryn was kind, loyal, brave, and always thought of others before herself, as we will come to find out in this story. She was the truest friend anyone could have, and I think everyone should strive to be like Kathryn. Now let's jump into what took place. It was the evening of Labor Day, on Monday, September 3rd, 1993, between the hours of 7 p.m. and 10 p.m. on Lee Street, now known as Martin Luther King Jr. Drive in Starkville, Mississippi. Betty and Kathryn were at Kathryn's house, having already ate dinner and taken their baths and put their pajamas on to get ready to watch the baseball game. Betty was staying the night with Kathryn because Kathryn's sister-in-law stayed the night before and she just didn't get much sleep, so Betty had talked to her and agreed to stay so that the sister-in-law could get rest and come back the next night, which sadly never came. Kathryn was an amputee and wheelchair bound, so she needed someone to help her do certain things. So there was a knock on the door, and Betty went to answer the door. It was a man that they didn't know. The stranger stabbed Betty in the neck, slashing her throat, even though Betty fought back and tried to protect her friend, screaming, giving Kathryn warning that something was wrong. And she was left for dead. The stranger then went straight to Kathryn. He took Kathryn to the bedroom and told her, "I don't want to hurt you like I hurt your friend." She was also told to put her hands above her head and keep her eyes open, which is just disgusting and so sick. Kathryn was brutally attacked, strangled, and raped. He even asked her if she liked how it felt. which is so gross and despicable. And he wanted her to keep her eyes open while he did this to her. It's unforgivable. Now, the murderer and the rapist left, vanishing into the night, probably hoping he left Kathryn for dead as well. But Kathryn ended up mustering up enough strength and courage, even with all the bleeding, the broken ribs, and a hip, on top of her already not having a left leg, found a pillow to glide into the kitchen, where there was a phone on the wall with a long cord that she was able to knock down and call 911.
Your name is Miss Crigler?
Yes, the driver was one single boy, young man, and he went in the front room where my friend was, and he came back in with his hands all bloody, and then he raped me. I know I did. It's just terrible.
Police came, and at the time, David Lindley was the lead investigator. They went to the carport and saw Kathryn sitting on the floor. They had to break a kitchen window to get inside. They got Kathryn into the ambulance to go to the hospital, but before she left, all she could think about was her friend, Betty. Kathryn stated, "If Betty doesn't make it, I don't think I'm going to make it." Kathryn couldn't imagine living in a world without her dear friend Betty. Kathryn did go on to live another 2 months, never returning to the scene of the crime, but spent that time in a hospital and a nursing home until she passed. The medical examiner believed that the assault contributed to her death. The attack had emotionally and physically weakened her, and that attack sped up the progress that led to her death. So now, the Starkville Labor Day killer had 2 deaths on his hands. The killer did leave behind fingerprints, blood, hair, and a cigarette butt, which neither Betty or Kathryn smoked. They also ended up doing a rape kit on Kathryn and was able to get semen DNA of the killer. This murder looked like there wasn't a reason or a motive, and the only thing taken was $28 from Kathryn. Without Kathryn living, we wouldn't have the story of what happened and certain things in this case that moved it forward. Sadly, Kathryn had to relive this night many times in speaking with police and giving details for the composite to be made of the killer and attacker. She stated the killer was a young white man, no older than 30, about 5'10", who had short, light brown hair that was kind of cut like a crew cut, with blue eyes and a swarthy complexion, meaning a slightly darker skin tone or a suntan. On September 7th, just a few days after the crime, the composite was released to the public. In these days, there was no 24/7 news cycle, especially on holiday weekends. There weren't computers and internet and cell phones, so it took a minute for word to spread. The police talked with neighbors, friends, and family. Police investigated a drifter lead that went nowhere. They did find out that a neighbor had had a party on the same night, and that neighbor did leave the party at one point, but no one could remember how long. The neighbor was also known to carry a knife and smoked the same cigarette brand found at the scene. This neighbor had also given a cryptic and possibly incriminating statement to a witness at the crime scene. The neighbor said, maybe he didn't do it, but maybe his other self did. Like, what in the world? I hope he was drunk or thinking he was funny, because why would a person just randomly say that? Anyways, at this point in the investigation, there wasn't enough to make an arrest. Many people in the town believed this neighbor was the culprit, though. After 3 years, the case was aired on America's Most Wanted, hosted by John Walsh. Lead investigator Lindley even helped at the show's headquarters in D.C. Many tips came in, but nothing had panned out. In 2003, the case was handed over to Detective Lott at the time. When Lott took over, he inherited boxes of evidence, hundreds of pages of police reports, and over a decade and a half of frustration with this case. Lott believed this was solvable. He had time, technology advancements, and new eyes that just might be what this case needs. In 2005, the semen was sent to the lab, and a semen-based DNA profile was done on the killer. They compared it to the neighbor that had had the party, which was the #1 suspect, and the DNA was not a match. This profile also helped rule out another 60 people using CODIS. Some people thought it was still the neighbor, but Detective Lott knew that since there was no match, he wasn't. This was during the time that DNA really wasn't on the map, and DNA was not even into effect until 1995, so it really wasn't logged back then. So Lott knew that people weren't planting things or being careful as maybe they would be today. This case also changed Lott's view on the death penalty because he believes this wrong suspect would have been convicted and possibly executed for something they had nothing to do with. Lott now says the death penalty should be a case-by-case basis, and he's not just 100% for it like he was. This, to me, is what makes a good detective, or whatever other titles that Lott ended up with. He is one of the good ones. He has an open mind and doesn't have tunnel vision that sometimes we see in these cases, sadly. We need more law enforcement like this, which we know not all officers and police departments run like this or are created equally. Now jumping about 10 years from when this profile was created. In 2015, the suspect's DNA profile test resulted in 2 possible family names associated with the suspect's profile in some way, but those specifics aren't really known. The family's names were Hicks and Devine, and I still don't know what the importance of those are that go with the suspect and the killer in this case. On January 19th, 2019, 48 Hours ran an episode about this case, also called Knock Knock, like the podcast. It is season 31, episode 19. This episode coincides with the timing of the podcast that Betty's step-grandson puts out. And the link for this 48-hour episode will also be in the description box down below. Now, something that we learn through this is that when Jason goes to marry his wife, they had a bridal shower, and at this bridal shower there are 2 women that come in, and one happens to be the granddaughter of Kathryn Crigler, Juki. And the other one is the mother of the groom. And these 2 women get to talking at the bridal shower, and come to find out they both are connected to this case in Starkville. That is, it's unexplainable that this bridal shower took place in Tennessee, and Jason originally was from Texas, and the murders happened in Mississippi. But here, on this day, in Tennessee. These two families merged again unknowingly. It really makes you wonder sometimes how things just so happen to be. So about 6 months later, in June of 2019, Lott sent the DNA to Parabon Nanolabs in Reston, Virginia. They wanted to see if using DNA phenotyping, which means predicting a person's appearance from DNA. Dr. Ellen Graytack, the lead scientist at Parabon at the time, said that phenotype had only been available to law enforcement for less than 4 years. Not many police forces were using it, and as of 2017, Mississippi still hadn't put into legislation or had protocols done to use familiar DNA. So Lott couldn't use this tool yet, until now. Genetics and ancestry determined the face shape to skin tone, then some freckles, light brown hair, light blue eyes, just as Kathryn Crigler had described. Of course, this technology didn't know about tattoos, age, weight, or scars, but this can be a great tool for narrowing focus in an investigation and ruling out suspects. Later, they received 2 composites from Parabon, one being an image of what could the perpetrator look like today, and one of what he might have looked like back then in 1990. Now, while the investigation continued still in Starkville, Parabon was continuing to use their work using genetic genealogy. Now, you may have heard about this because it was used to find the Golden State Killer, Joseph DeAngelo, the Grim Sleeper, Lonnie Franklin Jr., and most recently, the Gilgo Beach murderer, Rex Heuermann. Using GEDmatch, a database in which people have chosen to publicly share their DNA for other people to search, have also given special permission for law enforcement to use it. The killer's profile in this case was compared to about 1 million people, and there were matches. And this match eventually led to finding the Starkville Labor Day killer and the start of justice for Betty Jones and Kathryn Crigler. Parabon gave Detective Lott the name Michael Wayne Devon, 51 at the time. He was twice divorced and a father of 3. Michael worked in construction and farming most of his life, and he was actually being held just a few hours away on drug charges. He wasn't in CODIS because he didn't have any known prior criminal history until recently. He hadn't ever really served time or anything. To know for sure that this was their guy, police retrieved a cigarette butt discarded while in custody on the drug charges. It was a match, and almost 30 years later, a day that the family wondered if would ever come, with questions still looming. Why did he do this? Why did he pick them? Unfortunately, I don't know if he will ever answer those questions. Something about the picture that we just saw is he was wearing an Ole Miss shirt. And it's just kind of funny because that would be Betty and Kathryn's Mississippi rival. You've got Ole Miss, which is the University of Mississippi, and then you have Betty and Kathryn's love for Mississippi State. So even in that, they clashed. It was just kind of funny that he's wearing a rival shirt when he gets arrested. But a grand jury indicted Devon for 1 count of capital murder and sexual battery in 2019. He was transferred to Starkville from the other jail to face charges for Betty and Kathryn. On Betty's birthday, oddly enough, is when the announcement that her murderer was in custody. A press conference announcing it was done that day as well. Some reports say that his bail was set at about 10 to 11 million. Others say that his bail was denied. He obviously is a huge flight risk because he had been avoiding the consequences for 28 years. I don't think they would just let him out when it took that long to capture him. So I think bail was set appropriately in this matter. Michael Devon did enter a plea of not guilty at one time. And then he later entered a plea of guilty, and this did not end up going to trial. With this plea deal, prosecutors took off the sexual battery for him pleading guilty, which I get that sometimes they do things like that, but the sexual battery was for Kathryn. And while it's great that he pled guilty, it just, to me, doesn't seem like there's justice for Kathryn, which is heartbreaking. Devon was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Now, the part of the reason that he entered this pleading and didn't take this to trial and pled guilty was just to avoid the death penalty. And so that's why I think if they would have still kept both charges on there and just still gave him life in prison, that would cover Betty and that would cover Kathryn. I don't know if they are allowed to do that. Just to say, hey, you plead guilty, you're going to still have these same charges, but you're just not going to be sentenced to death. You will just have life in prison, which still doesn't seem like enough, because for 28 years, he got to continue living his life, doing whatever he wanted. And that is not justice. And but yeah, let's give them a break. I know they do what they've got to do, but it just is not right. It's not fair. But sometimes that's the criminal process. And that is the story of Betty Jones and Kathryn Crigler. Two women who deserve so much better and gave so much in their life. We need to remember these women, because these two women could be our grandmothers, could be our parents. And we want to make sure that their family and friends know that their lives mattered. They made an impact on this world. They left their mark here. And the person that brutally took them away, he's worthless. He does not matter. His mark means nothing. If you want to follow us for more stories as we migrate true crime in the U.S., hit that like button, subscribe, share this video, and I will see you next time.